Välkomna till Uppsala Pingst och till kvällens föredrag. Ikväll är det ett föredrag som samarrangeras mellan Apologia och Uppsala Pingst. Så det kommer bli ett jätteintressant apologetisk sammankomst. Stefan som representerar Apologia kommer att komma upp snart och presentera talaren. Men först lite praktisk information. För er som är nya här finns det toaletter när man går ut för foajén här till vänster. Och där finns det också värdar som kan svara på eventuella frågor. Sen så hålls föredraget på engelska, så för er som vill ha tolkning till svenska kan gå ut till foajén och ut i foajén till höger och ta tolkningutrustning. Och det är kanal 2 som är på engelska då. Yes. Varsågod Stefan.
Så roligt att vi får vara här i Pingstkyrkan i Uppsala. Det känns jättebra att vi får ha det här samarbetet. Tackar för det. Roligt att se er här, roligt att ni kommer. Jag vill understryka det här med tolkning. Att om du känner att det vore en fördel för dig att få föredraget på svenska, så gå ut och ta tolkningsanläggning. Det kommer vara en excellent tolkning. Det är min kära kollega Mats som kommer att stå för den. Så att passa på och använd det erbjudandet. And now I think I will switch over to English. So this evening is arranged by the Pentecostal Church here in Uppsala and Apologia, Center for Christian Apologetics, which I'm the director for. And you have seen on the slide with Apologia that we have a vision. We have stolen or borrowed a formulation that the well-known American apologist Ravi Zacharias often talk about, helping thinkers to believe and to help believers to think. And our vision is to help Christians to understand their faith and to see the foundation in truth that the Christian faith have. We work with helping churches to develop more of a culture of apologetics, meaning a culture where all questions are welcome, where faith is not only proclaimed, but also motivated and argued for. And we work with training people in persuasive evangelism, that is, showing the truth of the Christian faith, putting it into contrast with the available alternatives, and showing the strength and the relevance and the beauty of the Christian faith. And as part of the work we do in Apologia, we arrange these kinds of lecture. And tonight we have a crucial subject before us about the reliability of the Gospels. You know, I have here in my hand the 4 really foundational texts for our culture. There are no other texts more important for European or for Swedish culture than the 4 Gospels. But how to view them historically. And if you think about the content of the Gospel and their message about Jesus Christ, there is no issue more important than the issue, was he really the Son of God? Was he really raised from the dead? And in order to wrestle with those issues about the identity of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus, you cannot bypass the 4 Gospels. And we have all the issues about the historical reliability of the Gospels. We are surrounded by a culture filled with critique against the Gospels. And that's why we want to arrange this evening on the reliability of the Gospels. The format of the evening will be, there will be a lecture, and afterwards we will have a good time for Q&A. So please remember when you are listening that there will be this possibility of asking questions. there is a beautiful phone number, that's my cell phone, and you can text your questions during the presentation to that number, and we will bring up at least a number of those questions. And we will also send a mic around in the room, so you can ask your question live. So you have two options, and we really want to encourage you to take this opportunity to ask serious questions. We are really happy that tonight's speaker is Mike Licona. Mike is a New Testament scholar, a historian, and a well-known Christian apologist. He's a professor at Houston Baptist University, and he runs a very strategic apologetic ministry called Risen Jesus. You can find it on risenjesus.com. He has written a number of very influential books, and for today's subject, it can be good to know that he has debated a number of the most well-known critics of the New Testament and critics of the four Gospels. I guess a number of you have heard the names of Bart Ehrman, or maybe Dominic Crossan, or maybe Richard Carrier, world famous for their skepticism against the historical reliability of the Gospels. And Mike have debated all of them and many more. So he really knows the subject. And Mike, we are so encouraged that you are with us here tonight. So please help me to welcome Mike Licona with a warm hand.
You all hear me? Oh, all right. Well, thanks for inviting me here. I appreciate the Pentecostal Church here for hosting this evening's event. And I want to thank Apologia, Stefan, and Fernando, and Victoria for their ministry of Apologia, and Fernando and Victoria for what you guys are doing and starting your apologetics ministry. And just really excited about all three of you guys. This is a very vital ministry of Apologia that they have here in Sweden, very much needed. And so when they're telling me about their ministry, I'm getting very, very excited about what they're doing for the kingdom in this country. So thanks for inviting me to be at this evening's debate. Sorry, that's Thursday, right? Anyway, so yeah, thanks. So this evening we're going to talk about the historical reliability of the Gospels. And let me just tell you a little bit and getting started where I'm coming from. I grew up in a Christian family in the United States, and I became a Christian at the age of 10. I went to a Christian university for undergrad where I was a music major, and I pursued a master's degree in New Testament studies, and during that time, I was just loving reading the New Testament. I was taking as much Greek as I could, and they created Greek courses for me. I took 10 graduate level courses, the equivalent of 5 years of Greek, and just spending so much time loving reading the New Testament in its original language. And then one day I asked myself the question, how do I know that this stuff is really true? And if it's not true, then I don't really care about reading it in any language. I'd been brought up in a Christian family. Maybe the reason I believe as a Christian is because that's the way I was raised. If I'd been brought up in Afghanistan, maybe I'd be a Muslim. If I'd been brought up in India, maybe I'd be a Hindu. Or in China, I'd be an atheist. So why is it that I believe what I believe? I think I've got this relationship with God, but people of other faiths and worldviews think that everybody's convinced what they believe is true. And if what I believe is not true, and I've just brainwashed myself to think that, then I'm devoting myself potentially to a fairy tale. And I didn't want to do that, and it could cost me eternity. So I started to look at the evidence and pursued that, and I became very much convinced that Jesus rose from the dead, that the historical evidence pointed to that. And as I began getting involved in public debate and defending the historicity of Jesus' resurrection, my opponents, like Bart Ehrman, would spend most of their time criticizing the Gospels. And whereas I would argue that if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, even if what Bart says about the Gospels is true. And even Barth would agree with that the Gospels could have errors in it and contradictions, and even if we had no idea who wrote them, that Christianity would still be true if Jesus rose from the dead. And he agrees with that. So, but his arguments against the Gospels were shaking the faith of a lot of Christians. So I decided that I would start dealing with these things. And 8 years ago, or 2 years ago, I published a book after 8 years of study on gospel differences, where I was trying to read the Gospels in view of their ancient genre as biographies, understand them in that context, and it's amazing how much light that sheds on the Gospels. I'll be sharing some of that with you this evening, just some of it. But then I thought, well, even if we were to answer all the negative arguments against the Gospels, that still does not mean that they are reliable in a positive sense. Because what you have to do then is give some positive arguments to think that they're reliable. So even if all the arguments against the Gospels fail in terms of trying to discredit them as reliable sources, even without those arguments, we still don't have a positive case for the reliability of the Gospels. And so I started to think, well, what are some positive arguments that one could give? What's the positive evidence that the Gospels are reliable? I deal in another lecture answering the objections against the reliability of the Gospels. But this evening, I'm going to deal with some positive arguments for the reliability of the Gospels. So this evening, we're talking about, are the Gospels historically reliable? What are some positive arguments for it? So as we get into this, we first have to ask the question, what is it we mean by the term historically reliable? All right, well, let's talk about what it doesn't mean. It does not mean divinely inspired. It does not mean inerrant, infallible, or authoritative. Historically reliable does not mean any of these terms. So, for example, when I come to the book of Psalms in our Bible, here's a question I'm asking all of you right now. It's not a trick question. Are the Psalms historically reliable? Interesting question, isn't it? How many of you would say the Psalms are historically reliable? Okay. How many of you would say the Psalms are not historically reliable? Okay. Few of you in both of them, and the rest of you are saying, I'm not going to be tricked by this American up on stage. All right, let me tell you, the Psalms are not historically reliable. Do you believe the Psalms are divinely inspired? Yep. You believe they're infallible? Yep. Do you believe that they're historically reliable? Nope. Why not? Because they're not historical literature. It's like asking if the color blue meets government standards for clean water. It's like, it's incoherent. It doesn't apply. And you don't say, it's like saying, well, is the parable that Jesus taught, are the parables that Jesus taught historically reliable? No, because they're not historical in nature. They're not supposed to be. Because they're literature. They're parables. They're fictitious stories. The Psalms are not historical literature. They're poetry. They're songs. So something can be divinely inspired without being historically reliable. Now, I'm not saying they're historically unreliable. I don't think you could say the Psalms are historically unreliable either. It's the wrong question. Now, suppose we take Tacitus's Annals of Rome. Tacitus is regarded as one of the most accurate of Roman historians. Could we say he's historically reliable? Well, yeah. But he's not divinely inspired, is he? He's not infallible. He's not inerrant. So something can be historically reliable without being divinely inspired or infallible. It can contain errors in it. He can contradict himself. It could still be reliable. It's just not perfect. So something can be reliable without being perfect. Something can be perfect without being reliable. These terms they're not the same. They're not synonyms. So when we come to the Gospels in the book of Acts, we could say, well, are they historically reliable? That is a relevant question because they're ancient biographies. In that case, we could say something could be, at least in principle, historically reliable and divinely inspired, infallible, inerrant. But not necessarily so. They could be, maybe not. Tonight, we're going to ask the question, are they historically reliable? I'm not going to try to answer the question, are they infallible or divinely inspired? There's no way that a historian, with the tools historians have, can answer if the Bible is divinely inspired. That's a theological question. So it's like the statement, Jesus died for our sins, or Jesus' death atones for our sins. The historian can verify that Jesus died. The historian cannot verify that his death atones for sins. That's a theological statement. It could be true, but a historian can't prove it. Tonight, I'm only dealing with history, okay? So if I say something, you say, well, he thinks there may be contradictions. No, I didn't say that. I'm just saying, but even if, it doesn't matter. You follow me with that? I'm only dealing with the historical question tonight. So how do we define historically reliable? Well, this becomes a little difficult when it comes to ancient literature because ancient literature historians had different rules by which they would write than we have today. They were not as concerned about the accuracy that a lawyer would want as we are today. We want to know exactly, precision. What time did that person get in an accident? Was it 3:20 or was it 3:22? It's a big difference here. Was it a blue car? Or was it kind of blue-green in nature? Was it dark blue or light blue? You know, we want that kind of precision. Were they coming from southwest or was it west or was it south? We want to know precisely. Ancients didn't care about that kind of thing. In fact, the way I'd put it is, well, how many of you are married in here? Okay? Well, you all know the difference when I say there's the guy version of the story and there's the girl version. Now, girls, generally speaking, I'm just going to give stereotype here. There are plenty of exceptions. But for the most part, women like details. Lots of details. They want to know what happened, where it happened, when it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were saying, what they were wearing, what they were thinking, and how they were feeling. And then they want to know, after they've told you the story, how do you feel about it? Us guys, we're different. We want bullet points. Get to the bottom line. The game is coming on in 5 minutes. Right? And us guys, we will think of abbreviating the story. We can change some details just slightly in order to get our point across a little more succinctly and clearly. And you know how it is. You might be talking to someone and you get in an argument with them. And you come back and you're telling someone about that argument. You're not repeating things exactly how it happened. In fact, you'll edit that a little bit so that you're making your points maybe a little more clearly than you did in that actual argument. Well, that's kind of what guys do when we abbreviate and we change things to make things more accurately. So I don't know how it is in Sweden, but in the United States, I can tell you, a lot of us guys will be on the phone telling a story to someone, and our wives are in the background saying, you know it didn't happen that way. Well, we're not trying to mislead. We're just trying to be clear and concise and get our point across. I'm not saying the guy version or the girl version, I'm not saying that one is better than the other, they're just different, okay? So when it comes to ancient history writing, they were more inclined to give the guy version of the story, some more than others. Same thing with the Gospels. John gives the guy version of the story big time. Mark gives the girl version. All right, that's just, and Luke, they give the girl version of the story. They give the girl version of the story. So when we're talking about historically reliable, we have to keep in mind in the way the ancients wrote what was reliable for their day, what were their objectives. We have to apply it to all ancient literature, not just the Gospels. Whatever we're going to say is reliable would apply also to other ancient historians and biographers, not just the Gospels. Because we don't want to come up with criteria that it's prejudice in favor of the Gospels. We want to be fair if we're going to look at this logically. Again, we have to consider the genre or literary type which the Gospels are, and they're ancient biographies. I saw the book outside you have in Swedish, And my friend Nabil Qureshi, who died last year, he converted to Christianity several years ago, and he became a rock star in the world of Christian apologetics. And he wrote a book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and it became a bestseller. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I knew Nabil, and we were friends when he was a Muslim. And I saw his journey to Christianity, and we had good friends over the years. But he just became so popular out there and traveled all around the world. And sometimes I'd have someone come up to me and they'd say, so you're Mike Licona? Yeah. You're Mike Licona? Yeah. Really? I'm getting to meet Mike Licona. I can't believe this. I said, yeah. And he said, so if you're Mike Licona, that means you know Nabil Qureshi. He just became so famous, So in the introduction of his book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, which again in Swedish, they have it available, you can buy it out there. He says this: by its very nature, a narrative biography must take certain liberties with the story it shares. Please do not expect camera-like accuracy. That is not the intent of this book. And to meet such a standard, it would have to be a 22-year-long video, most of which would bore even my mother to tears. The words I have in quotations are rough approximations. A few of the conversations represent multiple meetings condensed into one. In some instances, stories are displaced in the timeline to fit the topical categorization. In other instances, people who were present in the conversation were left out of the narrative for the sake of clarity. All of these devices are normal for narrative biographies. Please read accordingly. Now, that's a modern biography written by a meticulous academic today. In antiquity, they did all these things and much more, and liberties in the way that they would report and write narratives. And we have to take that into consideration. So when we speak of ancient literature being historically reliable, I'm pretty much thinking along those lines that what we're meaning is that what we are reading preserves an accurate gist or an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. It's true enough. So guys, the next time you're talking to someone and your wife says to you, it didn't happen that way, you turn around to her and you say, honey, it's true enough. All right, so that taken out of the way, or covered, we ask, when may an account be regarded as historically reliable? And so I want to present 6 criteria that must be fulfilled. The first one is historical intent. Do we have good reasons to think that the author intended to write an accurate account? Second, do we have good reasons to think the author used good judgment when choosing sources? Third, do we have reasons to believe the author used good judgment when using those sources? Fourth, was the author capable of reporting accurate history? In other words, the sources, were there good enough sources? Did the author have access to reliable sources? We're going to explain all these in depth, okay? Fifth, can we verify numerous reports that's in the account? And fifth, no more than a very small percentage of what is reported has a reasonable chance of being false. So some of it might be false, but only very small things and not much. Now, if all 6 of these are met, we can say something is historically reliable. And I think we'd agree that these are just pretty much common sense principles. So let's go through them one at a time. Number 1, do we have good reasons to think that the author intended to write accurate history? Well, in answer to that, we first take into consideration that the Gospels belong to ancient biographies. And why do we know this? Well, there were certain characteristics of ancient biographies, and we find these in the Gospels. There's like 10 or more, but let me just give you a few of them. Number 1, the emphasis is on a main character, not on an era, an event, or government. So, for example, there was a famous historian named Thucydides in the 5th century BC, and I think it's 5th century. And Thucydides wrote a history of the Peloponnesian War. You had ancient Athens, and they decide they want to expand, and they want to take control of all of what's Greece. And so they wanted to attack Corinth, which was in its own, like in its own country in that day. And so Corinth says, no, we don't want to become part of Athens and under their rule. And Sparta, who loved war, Sparta says, okay, well, we're in Corinth. We'll support you. We'll back you up. We'll be your ally. And so all of a sudden, all these other countries, which is present-day Greece, all of them ganged up when Athens tried to bring them in. They went and they fought against Athens, and Athens was pretty powerful, and it was a war that lasted nearly 30 years. It's called the Peloponnesian War. And finally, Athens lost. Well, Thucydides was an Athenian, and he lost. So you ever hear the saying, history is written by the winners? Well, history was written by one of the losers here. And it's one of the most highly respected and accurate accounts of antiquity. But he's talking about a war that lasted nearly 30 years. A biography is not focused on a war. Or Tacitus's Annals of Rome, he's talking about what happened year by year in the Roman Empire for a certain time. A biography is focused on a single person. It has more people, but it's about the life of that person, that one person. Another thing is a biography starts out with talking about that main character's ancestry, and then right after that launches into that person's public life, be it politics or the military or being a philosopher or an ethical teacher. So you ever wonder, why don't the Gospels talk more about Jesus as a child? It's like it gives the infancy narratives, the virgin birth, and then right after that it's boom, he's getting baptized and then tempted in the wilderness, and then he's into his ministry. I want to know about Jesus' childhood, you know? Well, the reason it does that, it's because it's a biography. And it does just what about every other biography does in that time. It talks about the ancestry, and then boom, launches into that public, the launching of that person's public service. So that's why we don't have Jesus' childhood for the most part in the Gospels. Number 3, the main subject's character is illuminated through their words and deeds. Now this is important. This is really important. When I realized this, and studying the other ancient literature like Plutarch's biographies written by Plutarch, and then all of a sudden I come to the Gospels, it's like, whoa, my eyes are open to some things I never saw before. It's really neat. So we'll get back to that in a couple minutes. The length of the biography was typically 10,000 to 25,000 words. Rarely went over 25,000 words because that's about all they could fit on a scroll. So it's interesting to note that Mark's gospel is just over 10,000 words. It's like 11,000 words. And then you've got Luke is the longest gospel, and he's getting close to 20,000 words. So it's pretty neat. Yep, so there you go. There's the exact words in Greek, how many Greek words there are, since Greek was the original language of these Gospels. Ancient novels, some skeptics, like a Richard Carrier, you'd mention him, some skeptics like to say that the Gospels are not biographies, they're ancient novels. But only those on the really, really far fringe of the theological left would say that. There's only a handful. Almost all New Testament scholars, even skeptical ones, would say the Gospels are biographies. They're not novels. Why? Because novels were typically romances in which two lovers had to overcome obstacles. Ancient novels rarely ever involved historical characters. And sometimes, rarely, but sometimes they would include a historical character, but never within the lifetime of the author. In fact, the only examples of ancient novels we have that involve a historical character, that character had died more than a century before the author was writing. So, yeah. So we have this biographical genre. Second, historical intent. Is there something in these that, now not all ancient biographies had honest historical intent. There are some of them, like an initial attempt by Aristobulus in his Life of Alexander the Great, and Philostratus's Life of Apollonius of Tyana. They're not really trying to be accurate historical. But most of them had an intent to write historically. So there are some things in the Gospels that suggest that they were trying to write accurate history. So in Luke chapter 1, verses 3 and 4, it says, "It seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know for certain the things you have been taught." So Luke is saying here his intent is to write an accurate account. Now that doesn't mean that he did, but we can see he might be lying, but at least he's saying from the outset that is his intent. Gospel of John. "And the one who has seen has testified. His testimony is true, and he knows he is telling the truth, so that you may also believe." The author of John's gospel is crystal clear. He's writing truth. Again, you might say that you don't believe John, you think he's lying, he's making all this up, but he is stating at least that he's telling the truth. When it comes to Mark's gospel, he's got something interesting in there. Toward the end, when Jesus is being marched off to be crucified, Mark adds, the soldiers, when Jesus stumbled and fell, it says, the soldiers forced a passerby to carry his cross, Simon of Cyrene, the father of Alexander and Rufus, who was coming in from the country. Now, why add he's the father of Alexander and Rufus? It's like this would be meaningless detail. You could make up the name Simon of Cyrene. I mean, Simon is one of the, I think, 5 or 7 most popular male Jewish names in antiquity. 1 in every 5 Jewish men who lived in the Judea and Galilee area, 1 in every 5 Jewish men in that area were named either Simon or Joseph back then. So it's a very popular name. So we could see if you're going to make up a name, you would say that. But he says he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. Why would you mention that? And many scholars have said it's probably because the people that Mark, the original readers of Mark's gospel would have recognized, they would have known who Alexander and Rufus is. So he's relating this so that oh yeah, it's that Simon. He's trying to tell accurate history. There are no contemporary competing accounts of Jesus in that time. Now, some scholars will point out things like the Gospel of Peter and some of these other unknown Gospels, but let's look at when they were written. First of all, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that are written in the 1st century. You have the Edgerton II Papyrus, 2nd century. Gospel of Thomas, 2nd century. Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, 2nd century. Gospel of Philip, 3rd century. Then you have what's called the secret Gospel of Mark that was discovered by Morton Smith in 1958. And many scholars today think that it was a forgery created by Morton Smith. So you've got all these 4 accounts of Jesus. They are all in agreement in the 1st century. And then after that, then you have these bizarre accounts. But they come after these initial ones. So we've got good reason to think the authors intended to write accurate history. Do we have reason to think that the authors of the gospel showed good judgment in their choice of sources? Did they choose their sources judiciously? And we do have reason to think that they did. Let's look at some reasons. First of all, we take Mark. Mark, most scholars think, was the first gospel to have been written. And we have a guy who's writing sometime in the early 2nd century named Papias. And Papias said that he got his information from an associate of one of the disciples of Jesus. And he says it's the disciple John. Scholars today, even evangelicals, debate whether he's talking about John, the son of Zebedee, or another disciple named John, a minor disciple of Jesus who wasn't one of the 12. So we don't know which one. I'd say most go with, they say he knew John, the son of Zebedee, the apostle. But there are legitimate questions on that. Either way, Papias said he had heard from one of the disciples' associates that Mark wrote down what he heard Peter say. Well, that's pretty good. And if he heard this from an associate of one of the disciples, and by the way, he said he heard it from this associate while that disciple was still around and preaching. So that brings it back into the first century when he heard this. And he heard from that associate of a disciple that Mark wrote what Peter said. That's pretty good. You know what we have for Plutarch? Plutarch is the greatest of all the ancient biographers. You'll have classical scholars say this. He's the greatest of all the ancient biographers. The Oxford Classical Dictionary says that most people have recognized that a lot of what we know from the ancient world comes from Plutarch. That he's the high standard of ancient biography. He's the high mark of ancient biography. How do we know Plutarch wrote this? Our most valuable source is something called the Lamprias Catalog. And that was written, we don't know exactly, but probably in the 3rd to 4th century, sometime in the 3rd or 4th century. And it's attributed, Lamprias is supposed to be Plutarch's son. Well, Plutarch dies around the year 120, just slightly after the year 120. So if he had a son, there's no way that son is living into the 3rd century or the 4th century. So we have a book, the Lamprias Catalog, that's written more than 200 years after Plutarch's death and falsely attributed to his son. And that is our primary source for knowing that Plutarch wrote those. And classical scholars don't question it. In fact, from antiquity through today, everybody attributes it to Plutarch. There was probably a better source in antiquity, and many times we don't know how they came to understand who wrote, that Plutarch wrote this, but they knew that he wrote it. So what we have for the Gospel of Mark is much better. You have Papias and you have several others who mention Mark wrote what he had heard Peter say. So that's pretty good stuff, and Peter was an eyewitness. So if that ancient testimony is correct, and I don't see any reason for rejecting it, did Mark use good discretion, good judgment in choosing his source? Well, I don't know who you could have chosen who would have been better than Peter, the lead apostle, someone who had walked with Jesus. And then you come to some of the other Gospels, Luke. And I'm kind of a little hesitant to get in some of these details. Yeah. What do you think? Should I get into some of these? Your call. Yeah? Okay. So, most scholars today would say that Luke used Mark as his primary source, but that Luke had other sources. So Luke says in the first 3 verses of his gospel that he was reporting what had been handed down to him by the eyewitnesses and the servants of the word. Well, it's kind of hard to know exactly what he's saying there. He's either saying that he got it from the eyewitnesses themselves, or that he got it from those who knew the eyewitnesses. Or it could be a little of each. So if we're talking Mark, he got it from someone who knew the eyewitness. If he got it from Paul, Paul was an eyewitness to the risen Jesus. He could have gotten it from some other eyewitnesses. What's Q? The Q's something it's called the Q hypothesis. It's been around for a long time, over 100 years. It's nothing to be intimidated about, and here's how it works. If Mark is the first gospel to be written, what scholars do is they look at the gospels very carefully, and they see that on many occasions that Matthew and Luke use Mark as one of their sources, okay? And that would be typical to do, because if Peter's authority is behind it, then why not? And Peter was behind. He saw a lot of things that Matthew and John and some of the others did not see, like the Gospels report about the transfiguration of Jesus, the raising of Jairus' daughter from the dead, Jesus' prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. He always took Peter, James, and John with him. He didn't take the others. He didn't take Matthew. So Peter would know some things that Matthew and some of the others wouldn't. So why not quote Mark, who's using Peter's recollections there, right? So if Matthew, Mark, and Luke are reporting the same story, I'm trying to simplify this. If Matthew, Mark, and Luke report the same story and we look at it and it's almost word for word, then scholars look and they said, well, Matthew and Luke in that point are using Mark as their source. But there are many occasions, there are about 220 verses in our Gospels, where Matthew and Luke are almost verbatim. They're telling the same story almost word for word. And that story is absent in Mark. Mark doesn't report it. So there's only three things that could be happening here. Either Luke is using Matthew as his source, or Matthew is using Luke as his source, or Matthew and Luke, just as they had used Mark in some ways, now they're using another source that we no longer have. And a majority of scholars like this view better than the other two views. And there are reasons for it. I can't get into them. I don't have time. But they think that Matthew and Luke used another source, like the Sermon on the Mount. That's in Matthew and Luke, but it's not in Mark. All right? And there are other verses that talk about it, like the Queen of the South and Jonah and Nineveh. You know, this is found in Matthew and Luke, but it's not in Mark. So if they're using a common source, but we don't have that source any longer, what do we call that? Well, the Germans it was the Germans who came up with this observation, and the German word for source is Quelle. So they just abbreviate that and call it Q. Q would be the hypothetical lost source that Matthew and Luke used for material that's common to their gospel, but Mark doesn't report. That's all it is. It's nothing to be intimidated about. I think that Q probably existed. I wouldn't die for that, because maybe Luke used Matthew, or Matthew used Luke. Okay, I think there's some decent arguments for that. It's just a working hypothesis that we go with. Okay, but either way, that's pretty good. What would Q be? Is it written, or is it oral tradition? We don't know. Slight majority would say it's probably written. So what might that be? Well, Papias talks about how Matthew originally wrote, he doesn't say he wrote a gospel, he wrote the sayings or teachings of Jesus in Aramaic. Maybe that's Q. Because Q is just sayings, teachings of Jesus. That's all it is, it's not narrative. So that could very well be what Papias is referring to, that Matthew originally wrote in Aramaic, later on got translated into Greek, and maybe under Matthew's supervision, he had a scribe use Mark as his primary source, and then he supplemented it with his notes that Matthew had taken of Jesus' teachings. It's pretty neat. And what's neat, some will point out, well, Q doesn't mention Jesus' death and resurrection. Well, maybe that's because they hadn't happened yet. He took notes of Jesus' teaching. And so he's doing this, of course, while Jesus is still alive. And then later on, he supplements Mark's gospel with Q and other sources. Pretty cool stuff, possibilities. Imagine how early that would be. Written whilst Jesus was still alive. That's pretty cool to think about. John, the evidence tells us that he was a disciple of Jesus, so he would have been an eyewitness. Now, some scholars, probably most scholars, would say that John, the son of Zebedee, was not the author of John's gospel. Of course, that goes against all the ancient church tradition, and one of the reasons they say this is because John so often speaks in the third person. You know, talk about, well, the beloved disciple, but he didn't say I. And so what's going on there? So maybe they're saying because he's talking about that disciple says these things, that disciple is reporting that things are true, and he knows that these things are true. That could be speaking in the third person, or it could be that someone was writing down what that disciple had said. And so a lot of them would say, well, it's not third person. He's just writing down what he heard this other disciple saying. But the early church tradition says it was one of Jesus' disciples, John, the son of Zebedee, who wrote it. So how do we, deal with that? Could it be one or the other? Yeah, is there a way to decide? I think so. You just can't avoid the unanimous testimony of the early church in that sense. I mean, if Mark is writing what Peter said, if Luke is writing what the others say, then why would you be embarrassed about saying the author of John's writing what John said? Why are the early church insisting that it was John? But then we got to ask, well, why would John write in a third person? Right? Isn't that kind of strange? Well, actually, it's not. Because when Julius Caesar wrote his commentaries on the Civil War, he wrote the entire thing in the third person. So there's some decent reasons to think that John the Apostle wrote this. Matthew's the most difficult one, but I've already kind of explained. In Matthew, and look, I'm sharing these things with you because whether you've heard them already or not, skeptics are saying these things. They're saying them online, they're saying them all around, and I don't want you to be caught off guard. All right? So some of these things, maybe you're hearing it for the first time. All right? That's okay. I'd rather you hear it from me than a skeptic, and you go, oh, man, my faith is shaken now. So Papias says that Matthew wrote his gospel in Aramaic. However, we don't really have any evidence that he wrote in Aramaic, and in fact, it's all in Greek today, and experts, even evangelical scholars, will say that what Matthew wrote is not translation Greek. It's not the kind of Greek that shows it had been translated from another language. All right, especially since Mark is his primary source, and Mark wrote in Greek. So what do we do with that? And if Papias is wrong on that, maybe he's wrong on the other stuff. Well, here's the thing. Papias doesn't say that Matthew wrote his gospel in Greek. He said he wrote the ta logia, the sayings, the teachings of Christ in Greek, or in Aramaic. And again, that could be the Q source. So that's not really a problem. And the unanimous church testimony of the early church is that Matthew wrote it. So I see no reason to think that Matthew could have had these sayings of Jesus, teachings of Jesus. Again, maybe it was the Q source. Or maybe it was one or more of Jesus's discourses, his sermons. There are 5 discourses in Matthew. Sermon on the Mount, the Olivet Discourse, just, when he's predicting the coming, his second coming. Maybe it was one or more of those that he's referring to. And those are the things that got translated from Aramaic into Greek. Anyway, I think there's a plausible explanation for it. And every reason, since the unanimous testimony of the early church is that Matthew is the author, I don't have any reason really to think that that's not true, that Matthew at least, even though he used Mark as a primary source, that Matthew was involved in the composition of the gospel named after him in a very major way. Number 3, the author shows good judgment in the use of the sources that he'd chosen. Now, we can compare how Plutarch and Josephus use their sources. Josephus quotes scripture a lot. In fact, just to tell you a little bit how they thought about accuracy, in the beginning of his Antiquities of the Jews, his Histories of the Jews, Josephus says, I'm going to quote everything accurately, I'm not going to add, I'm not going to subtract, I'm not going to change. And then when we read how he quotes from the Old Testament, we see at least how, by the way we measure things, he adds, he subtracts, and he changes. There are many, in my studies of Plutarch, there are over 3 dozen stories, there are at least 3 dozen stories in which Plutarch tells 2 or more times. You see, he's writing, in some cases, on some of the most interesting events in human history, and that is the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And that begins with Julius Caesar and then to his nephew, Caesar Augustus. Fascinating events. I mean, really fascinating. And when you see how these things interact with the biblical story, it's amazing. It really is. I'd love to just share some of it with you, but I don't have time. So really cool stuff. But you see how Plutarch, because he's writing biographies of Julius Caesar, of Cicero, of Pompey, of Antony, and all these great characters from that period. He's telling the same stories in multiple times because he's telling the same stories in each of those biographies because these people interacted with one another. Brutus killed Caesar, and Antony was there. So, of course, in Plutarch's biography of Antony, he's going to mention the assassination of Caesar. He's going to mention the assassination of Caesar in his biography of Caesar. He's going to mention the assassination of Caesar in his biography of Brutus because Brutus helped kill him. All right, so what we do is we compare how the same author using the same sources tells the same story. Does he copy and paste? What does he do? And we see that every occasion when we compare the stories, there are differences. And the differences are the same kind of differences we find in the Gospels. But Plutarch will edit, paraphrase, adapt his stories from biography to biography. And when we compare how Matthew and Luke use Mark as their source, we see that they adapt Mark far less. They edit and paraphrase Mark far less than what Plutarch does with his sources. It's pretty interesting. So sometimes you'll have scholars, skeptical scholars, say, well, the Gospels have all these contradictions. Well, they're not really contradictions in almost all of these cases. They're just these adaptations, these editing, paraphrasing. But if they were to apply this to, like, Plutarch, they would find vast more differences than what we find in the Gospels. We also asked the question about large-scale conjecturing, or, trying to reconstruct things, all right, and trying to figure out and guess what happened. Now, Plutarch wrote more than 60 biographies of these ancient figures, of which 50 have survived. And so he starts off by writing biographies of people like Caesar and Cicero and Pompey and Brutus and Antony and these characters. And he's writing about 140 years after these characters, these people had died. So Plutarch says he's got a lot of good sources for these. Well, listen to what he writes here. 140 years after these people had died is when Plutarch's writing. Well, look, now when he's talking about Theseus and Romulus, Theseus is the legendary founder of Greece, and Romulus is the legendary founder of Rome. When he's writing to them, and they lived 800 to 1,000 years before his own time, now you got to be involved in large-scale conjecturing. In fact, Plutarch says, he just talked about Caesar and Brutus and Antony and these guys, and he says, now that I have traversed those periods of time which are acceptable to probable reasoning and which afford basis for a history dealing with facts. So he's got really good sources when it comes to Caesar and Cicero and these guys. And now that I've dealt with those periods, he says, I might well say of the earlier periods of which I'm about to write, what lies beyond is full of marvels and unreality, a land of poets and fabulists, of doubt and obscurity. May I therefore succeed in purifying fable, making her submit to reason and take on the semblance of history. So what Plutarch is saying here, look, when I'm writing about Cicero and Caesar and Antony and Brutus, it's only 140 years after they had died, and so I've got plenty of really good sources before me that I can consult. But when I go way back in the past, like with Theseus and Romulus, 800 to 1,000 years before my own time, I don't have good sources. I have poets. That's about it. And I can't trust what they're saying. So he says, what I've done is I've taken the stories that they have and I've tried to take out all the incredible stuff and rewrite these stories to make them sound like history. But don't be under any illusion that these are reliable. That's what Plutarch's saying. Large-scale conjecturing, rewriting of the story and trying to guess what it would have been like. That's what he's saying when it comes way people in the past. But within 140 years, I've got great records, he says. So what about large-scale conjecturing in the Gospels? Well, the Gospels are written within 20 to 65 years of Jesus. Plutarch's writing about 140 years later. The Gospel's 20 to 65 years later. They're writing while the eyewitnesses are still alive. So yes, no, there's no reason to think that large-scale conjecturing was involved and guesswork when writing the Gospels. The authors were capable of recalling stories accurately. But there's more to it than just that, and it gets even more exciting here. Memory. Now, it is a big thing right now in scholarship where New Testament scholars, the skeptical ones, are trying to call into question the ability to memorize, to remember events. And they're saying our memories get corrupted over time. And they'll give examples like when you guys probably wouldn't know about this, but the Challenger spacecraft that NASA sent up, some of you remember that? I think it was January of 1986, and they sent up one of the first space shuttles, and it blew up. And I remember when that event happened. I remember where I was. I was really interested in the space program. So I remember that, but they interviewed some students at Emory University in the US, in the Atlanta, Georgia area, right after that event. And they said, what do you recall? And they asked them a bunch of questions. And then they asked those same students 6 months later, hey, they asked them the same questions, and they got different answers. And then they'd say to the student, well, you said that now, but here's what you said 6 months ago. And, well, just believe me now, I was wrong 6 months ago. Because their stories contradicted. Their own stories, they contradicted themselves. Their details had changed, which showed that even within as little as 6 months, our memories can get corrupted over time. Well, the problem, I think, with that is that you're talking about probably students who, for the most part, were not interested in the space program. It's like, I don't know how many of you remember, here in Sweden, 9/11 was not as big an event for you over here as it was for us in the US. It was huge for us. We remember that. And when I lecture around the US, I'll say, do you remember where you were when you learned that planes had been flown into the World Trade Center building? Oh yeah, we remember. Remember exactly where? Yep. Do you remember what the weather was like that day? And everybody, I said, yep, sunny, slightly cool, not a cloud in the sky, beautiful day out. We remember what the weather was like that day because it impacted us emotionally, big time. It's like, okay, well, students may not have been impacted by the Challenger the space shuttle blowing up, but I'll bet if you ask the family members of the 7 astronauts who died in that accident, they could tell you where they were and what the weather was like that day. So, just to point out corrupted memory over time, I think we can all agree that our memories aren't perfect. My wife reminds me of that all the time. All right? But it's good enough. For the most part, we do remember the gist of what happened. We might confuse some details, but we remember the gist. Now, my wife and I are really interested in World War II stuff. So when James told me last night, I said, hey, do you guys have any World War II stuff here? Things that happened here in Sweden? He said, no, we were spared. I said, darn. I'm glad you were spared, but it's like, it would have been nice to see something. So I was in this doctor's office a few years ago, and as I come out of the doctor's office, I'm finished with my appointment. As I'm walking out of the office, I see this old guy, he's probably in his 90s. And he's wearing this blue baseball cap that's got a B-29 Super Fortress, an American bomber that's embroidered on it. I thought, wow, that guy probably flew on one of those in World War II. And so I walked out, and then I just got too curious, and I came right back in, and I walked up to the guy and said, excuse me, sir, but did you by any chance fly on a B-29 in World War II? And he said, I sure did, son. I said, wow, you must have some amazing stories. And he said, yeah, this guy's a real manly man, Yeah, we were stationed in the Pacific Theater, and I'll never forget the native women on that island. They had a horrible odor to them. This is 70 years later, and he's remembering what the native women smelled like on this island. It's like, wow. Well, like I said, here in the U.S., we remember 9/11. We remember what the weather was like that day. We remember where we were at. And I have to admit, every September 11th, when they'll show a documentary or something about those buildings planes flying into them, I can't, even to this day, I can't see that and just not well up all inside and get tears in my eyes. Because I just remember that day that we were attacked, and we'll never forget that in the United States. Back in the Vietnam War, there was a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, and he led U.S. forces, some special forces, into Vietnam in November 1965, and it was the very first engagement between U.S. forces and the North Vietnamese Army. And he and a combat reporter named Joe Galloway wrote a book, Once We Were Soldiers, or We Were Young and Soldiers, or something like that. And they made a movie out of it, starring Mel Gibson as Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore and Sam Elliott as his sergeant. I don't know, maybe some of you have seen that movie. It's supposed to be a very accurate movie. And so a few years ago, my wife and I were watching this documentary called Vietnam in HD. We like war stuff. And we Americans, we like war, and we like carrying our guns and things like that. You have to excuse me a little bit. But, you know, there's a lot of crime in the U.S., so we like our guns. I mean, we don't like the criminals having them, but until they take them away from the criminals, we want to have them too. Because if they take them from us, the criminals will still have them. You know, so anyway, excuse me for being a cowboy. But so my wife and I are watching this documentary, Vietnam in HD, and in the very first episode, they bring on there and they interview Joe Galloway, the court reporter who had been in this movie, We Were Soldiers, but he was the real character. And he's describing his time over there, and there were occasions when he just welled up with tears about events that had happened 4 decades earlier. And it still had impacted him emotionally. And at one point, there was this 1-minute clip. It's like, wow, that's pretty powerful. And so I captured it, and I want to show it to you. It's only 1 minute long, but it'll give you an idea about how that war, his experience in that battle, it was a 4-day or 3-day battle at the Yadrang River Valley in November 1965. And this will give you a little idea of what he experienced. Let's see. There's some pictures from it, but here's him.
I left that landing zone X-ray.
Battlefield, knowing that young Americans had laid down their lives so that I might live. They had sacrificed themselves for me and their buddies. What I was learning was that there are some events that are so overwhelming that you can't simply be a witness. You can't be above it. You can't be neutral. You can't be untouched by it. Simple as that. You see it, you live it, you experience it, and it will be with you all of your days.
It'd be interesting to ask. I want you to imagine for a moment that you were one of Jesus' disciples. You traveled with him. You had seen him give sight to those born blind. You had seen him give hearing to the deaf. You'd seen him take people who were paralyzed and make it so that they could walk again. In fact, you saw Jesus walk on water. You saw him raise the dead. And then you saw him crucified. And then shortly thereafter, you saw him alive and in perfect health, having been risen from the dead. If you had witnessed that, do you think that that would leave an impression on you that would have been as deep and lasting as those 3 days of battle had on Joe Galloway? So Jesus' deeds, the things that he did, would have been memorable. You'd remember these things decades later. But what about Jesus' teachings? We have to remember Jesus was an itinerant teacher. Different from pastors of today, pastors have to come up with a new sermon every Sunday. I am glad I'm not a pastor. It's too hard. They have to come up with a new sermon every Sunday. Jesus didn't have to. We don't have to think that he had to come up with a new sermon for every village and town he went to. He probably had a dozen or 2 dozen sermons, and he preached those same things over and 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 over. And then, when they came back, when he did that, he sent out his disciples in twos. Because you've heard the best way to learn something is to teach it. So after they had heard him teach it so many times, he sends them out. Maybe some of them took notes like Matthew with the Q source. All right? They sent them out too, so that now they could correct one another. And Jesus also would say things in a manner that was easy to remember. He spoke in hyperbolic language. If your right eye makes you sin, rip it out and throw it from you. Unless you hate your family members, you can't be my disciple. We don't forget those kinds of things. And he teaches in parables, which are easy to remember and can be adapted according to his audience, whether they be Jewish or Gentile. And then they go out and they're teaching the same things they had heard Jesus teach over and 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 over. And then they come back and they debrief with Jesus, and he helps them and teaches them how to change some of these according to the audience to make it more applicable to them. And then they see Jesus crucified, and then he rises from the dead. He commissions them to go out and make disciples of all nations. And so for the next several decades, they preach the same things over and over, and you get the idea, thousands of times. This isn't something that they heard only once and they're trying to recall 40 years later, 20, 30, 40 years later. This is something that they had heard hundreds of times and then turned around and preached hundreds, if not thousands of times, all the way up until the time the Gospels are being written. So not only were Jesus' deeds capable of being remembered, so were his teachings. Number 5. When possible, we can verify the truth of numerous reported items. We can do this with the Gospels. Many items that we know that are in the Gospels, they agree with our existing background knowledge. So, for example, names. There have been 2 scholars over the last several years, Richard Bauckham and Tao Ilan, and they both have done studies on names in antiquity. And talking about Jewish names in antiquity. And they get this from They look at all the ancient writings that have survived. They look at inscriptions on tombstones and things like this that talk about Jewish names in the Jerusalem, Judea, Galilee area, and then in what's called the diaspora. These are Jews that are outside of that Judea and Galilee area. So they're named differently than what you find in Judea and Galilee. So they look at the different names, and what they find is they know certain names, like 1 in every 4 females at that time were named Mary. Very popular name. 1 in every 5 males were named either Joseph or Simon. The third most popular name was Lazarus. So we would expect to find these names, and frequently. In fact, of the 12 disciples, there are 2 Simons and 2 Judases. So you see these, and what's interesting, when they look at these names and the percentages of them and which ones are most popular, we find that reflected in the same way when the names in all 4 Gospels are put together. It's like, you can't plan that. It's like they weren't going around taking the census. Well, what's the most popular name this year? What's the most popular Jewish names this year? So this is what's really going on. And so when you have a child this year, here's what's popular. They didn't have that back in the 1st century. All right? So that's pretty neat. Then we see things like persons. The persons named in the Gospels, we find that we can verify the existence of many of them. People like Caesar Augustus, Caiaphas, the high priest, Herod the Great, Herod Archelaus, Herod Philip, Jesus, John the Baptist, Pilate, Tiberius Caesar. These are all historical characters. We know they existed. What about places? Places like Arimathea, Bethany, Bethesda, Bethlehem, Bethphage, Bethsaida, and all these, we know that these places existed. They're real places. These can be confirmed. What about procedures? Well, things like crucifixion and burial. It's kind of interesting. You'll have people like John Dominic Crossan and Bart Ehrman saying, well, the typical practice of the Romans is after they crucified a person, they just leave them on the cross for a long time, for days, and then afterward, they take them off the cross and throw them in a shallow pit to be devoured by dogs and insects and just put a little dirt over them. So that would have been Jesus' fate. Well, it is true that was the typical practice of the Romans. But what they don't tell you is that wasn't the typical practice of the Romans in Jerusalem. Because a lot of times when the Romans conquered a people, they allowed them to maintain their own customs. We find this with coinage in Jerusalem. The Jews did not want any image of a human being in Jerusalem. And so the Romans allowed them to produce coins without the emperor's image on it. I have one coin that's minted by Pontius Pilate from the year 29. Pontius Pilate minted 3 coins in 29, 30, and 31. None of them have the emperor's face on it. So that's the way it was in Jerusalem. They allowed them to keep that. Well, guess what Josephus reports? In his Jewish Wars, Book 4, Section 317, he talks about just a few years before the fall of Jerusalem in 70, when the temple was destroyed. He said that some mercenaries from the Romans hired, came into Jerusalem and they killed a bunch of the Jews, and they would not allow them to be buried. And the Jewish population got very angry because it says it had been their custom to remove the crucified and bury them prior to sunset, just like we find in the Gospels. They would not have been left on the cross for days. They would have been given a proper burial prior to sunset, just like the Gospels report. So even though that wasn't the typical custom of the Romans, it was when it came to Jerusalem. They allowed the Jews to maintain that. We can confirm many items about Jesus in the Gospels. This is called historical Jesus research. You can read about some of this with Stefan. He's got 2 books on this stuff. Volume 2 is about some things we can confirm about Jesus, right? Is that volume 2? Volume 2?
Yeah, 1.
1. So get volume 1. Get volume 2 too. But they're out there. They're great books. You guys have a great resource with Stefan here. In fact, you ought to be giving this lecture, not me, because he's written on the Gospels. So we can confirm many items about Jesus. In fact, the evidence is so good that a unanimous consensus of scholars today, including atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, they all agree that the evidence is sufficient to conclude that Jesus lived in the first century, that he was a Jewish itinerant preacher, that he believed God, he had a special relationship with God who had chosen him to usher in his kingdom, that he taught in parables, that he performed deeds that astonished crowds, and that he and his followers regarded as divine miracles and exorcisms, and that he was crucified on orders by the Roman governor Pontius Pilate in either April of the year 30 or April of 33 and died as a result. Hardly anyone would question those results. Again, Christian and skeptic alike agree on those things because the evidence is so good for them. And then scholars will say a number of other things about Jesus that many scholars agree on. But the ones I just think is that stuff that virtually 100% agree on. So there's many things that we can confirm. And then finally, only a very small percentage of reported items are known to be false. Well, I don't know anything in the Gospels that has been confirmed to be false, but I could say, in honesty, that there are only about a dozen, maybe at most 2 dozen, I wouldn't even say there are 2 dozen items in the Gospels, maybe 15 or so, that have a reasonable chance of being incorrect. Things like when Luke says that Caesar Augustus took a census when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. We haven't been able to confirm that. In fact, if we look at just some of the evidence we have, it would seem that Luke was off there. Now, there could always be some explanation that would show that Luke got it right. So we don't know if he's wrong. But many scholars suspect that that might be a detail in which Luke was wrong. So that's a possibility. We also have something in Matthew, in the genealogy, I think Matthew 1, verse 7, where it talks about a guy named Asa, when it should be Asaph, or maybe they say Asaph and it should be Asa. It's one of the two, because the genealogy in the Old Testament says one, but in the New Testament it says that. That's a possible misspelling or error. In Mark chapter 2, you have Mark saying, when Abiathar was high priest, David went in and he and his men ate the bread of consecration, which is typically not allowed. Well, when you go to the Old Testament, it's not Abiathar, it's the high priest, it's his father, Ahimelech. So which one is it? I mean, are these errors? Well, possibly, maybe not. But you know what? These are really, I mean, if this is it, that's not really a big deal. Remember, we're not talking about inerrancy or infallibility. We're talking about, are they historically reliable? And what I'm saying is, even if all these things that have an okay chance of being errors, even if they're all errors, now, plausible explanations have been offered for many of these. So I'm not saying that they are errors. But even if they are, it's in minor details. It could still be historically reliable. And our question is, are the Gospels historically reliable? And I'll say this too. Something that, again, Bart Ehrman has agreed on. If Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, period. It's true even if there are a few errors in the Gospels. Because if Jesus rose from the dead, he did so at least 20 years before the Gospels were written. So if he rose from the dead, Christianity is true at that point. It's true in the 20 years before the first Gospel's written. So how could an error in Mark nullify the truth of Christianity when it was true for 20 years before Mark was even written? You know, so let's keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing is the resurrection of Jesus. But we're talking about historical reliability here, so even if these things, there's only a few minor items. So even if these things that are possibly false, even if that were the case, it looks like the Gospels are still historically reliable. And that's pretty cool. So, wrapping this up, we talked about these 6 criteria, and we see that the Gospels fulfill all 6 of these criteria. We have good reasons, good grounds to say that they are historically reliable accounts of Jesus. You want more information? That's my website, my Facebook page, my Twitter handle. And why don't we open it up now for some questions?
Thank you very much, Mike. A big hand for Mike and John. And there will be a microphone passed around. So if you would like to ask a question, raise your hand, and Fernando will come with the mic. And then I received the number on the phone, and you can still send in text if you want.
Okay, thank you very much. Truly inspiring and interesting lecture. We're mainly Protestants here, I believe, and for us, to look at the text and to follow that is very important to us. Would you say that there is a maybe not invisible, but is there also a kind of the tradition itself? You were mentioning in the case of John as writer of his gospel. Would you say the mere existence of the church as a sociological entity is that also taken into account when they deal with these? Is that a fact that affects scientists when they take into account as some kind of proof or, well,
For like the resurrection?
Yeah, because when they talk about the church, they say it's the oldest organization in the world, and they say it's the oldest continuous group of people clinging on to the same thing.
I wouldn't say it's the oldest. I mean, Hinduism and Buddhism have been around for hundreds of years longer than the church, and I wouldn't say that's evidence that they're true.
So the scientists, do they only look at the text, or do they also look at the church as a constellation of people bringing a message throughout the ages?
I'm not sure what your question is.
It is the reliability of these texts is one thing, but also the existence of people continuously clinging to the message, and even without text in many cases.
I mean, with the Hindu and Buddhist text, these things definitely evolve over time. So in the I think it's the early Pali manuscripts of the Buddhist scriptures, there's no miracles. When you get to the Sanskrit, which is in the first century, 400 years after the Buddha had died, then you find all kinds of miracles in it. And even Hindu scholars will tell you today that traditions about Krishna and so forth, they have evolved over time, and they're entirely fine with that. Christians aren't, and we can see from the manuscript evidence we have that the integrity of the text has indeed been preserved over the 2,000-year period since the New Testament literature was written. But I'm not sure that that addresses the question you're asking.
Is that something unusual for Christianity? The kind of...
Oh, yeah, well, unusual for some things prior to then, but I mean, then we have the Jewish scriptures, which were written, the Old Testament, which is written before the New Testament, and we don't have anything close to the manuscript evidence for the Old Testament that we have for the New Testament. Old Testament scholars are really envious of New Testament, those of us in New Testament, because we have so much more with which to work in terms of manuscripts, in terms of cultural background evidence from which we can confirm things about Jesus that we just can't with the Old Testament. So even the New Testament is on far better grounds than the Old Testament for these kinds of things. I would say the Quran has some pretty decent evidence for it in terms of the text being presented. Now, I don't think it's as good as we have for the New Testament, because within 14 to 20 years of Muhammad's death, Uthman recognized there were a lot of manuscripts, and a lot of those manuscripts were contradicting, or there are discrepancies in them, I should say. Not necessarily contradicting, but discrepancies. And so he basically had his authorized text and chose the ones he wanted, and then he burned and destroyed the rest of them. So we will never be able to know if the Quran we have today is what was originally written. And in fact, there is some hadith that one of Muhammad's best friends claimed that in the Quran, there was a surah that Muhammad had given them, but it wasn't in the Quran. And what's that? Okay. Oh, okay. Well, thanks. Appreciate that. And so we know at least one surah that has been lost. So you have that. But the Quran, as we have today, is probably a pretty good representation of what was originally given. But we'll just never know for sure. So thanks for adding that.
Mike, I have a question here. You mentioned genealogies.
Yeah.
In the Gospels, and there are two genealogies.
Yes.
And here is a question: which genealogy is Mary's, and why do you think so?
Well, that's a good question. And for many years, there have been people who have suggested that Mary, Jesus coming through Mary's line is in Luke, and through Joseph's line is in Matthew. But that is largely rejected by scholars today. So what's going on? Why the differences in the genealogies? And there's something artistic going on here. I've got a video you can look on my website, risenjesus.com, and it's talking about the difference in the genealogies. It's only a couple minutes long, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, something like that. And so here's what's going on. When you read Matthew's genealogy, there are 17 verses. And when you get to verse 17, chapter 1, verse 17, it says, so these are all the generations. You've got 14 generations from, Abraham to David, 14 from David to the deportation of Babylon, and 14 from the deportation to Jesus. So say, well, that's interesting. He's saying these are all the generations, 3 times 14. Well, there's more generations in Luke. So how can Matthew say these are all the generations? And then he's got it 3 times 14. Why in these really nice groups of 14? And then when you look at it a little more carefully, you notice that he's cheated with the third group. So not only has he omitted certain generations, but when it comes to the third group, he uses the last name of the second one as the first name in the third, Jeconiah. So again, he cheats with what's going on. So you say, well, why is he doing this? And then you recognize that in ancient Hebrew, there was a rhetorical device called gematria. And gematria is when you took a letter and you assigned it a numerical value. So I don't know what the Swedish alphabet is, but in English, A, B, C, D. So A is 1, B is 2, C is 3. When you go through the Hebrew alphabet, they would do that as well. Well, when you look at names, like there are no vowels in ancient Hebrew. There are only consonants. So the word David, Dawid, would have 3 letters, a D, V, and a D. D is a 4, the V is a 6, and then you have D is a 4. What's 4 plus 6 plus 4? 14. And this is a common literary rhetorical device that the Hebrews would use. And scholars have recognized for a long time that Matthew is emphasizing Jesus' Davidic ancestry. He's the son of David, the Messiah. That's the emphasis in Matthew. So what Matthew does is he takes a genealogy. He doesn't invent names, but he artistically arranges them in 3 sets of 14, which the original readers could see. And he's trying to say, through his artistic representation of the genealogy, that Jesus is the son of David. And he says it 3 times for emphasis. Jesus is the son of David, the Messiah. So if we are looking at things in a very literal sense, we're going to miss that. But if we recognize how ancient biography was written and saw that they took some flexibilities, we're fine with it.
I have 2 questions. First question is Jesus simply a retelling of the Horus mythology? And the second question is, we believe that the whole Bible is the Word of God. If that is the case, how can even 1% be, an error?
Oh, great questions, both of them. And first of all, I don't want to meet you in a dark alley because, man, you are big and you are intimidating looking. And it's like guys like this I don't like to be around because they make me just feel so weak, It's like, it'd be great if you're single and you go around the body like that, go up to an attractive woman and say, "Excuse me, but can you tell me, is the beach that way or is it that way?" Anyway, there you go. In answer to your question, Ari, is the story of Jesus being resurrected, is that just a retelling of the story of Horus? Well, I've got a whole lecture on this, so let me just give you a few really quick answers. Today, even skeptical scholars, it's the virtually unanimous consensus among them that the Christians did not borrow from pagan myths of dying and rising gods. It's a good monograph that was written on this. I think it was 2001. Maybe you guys know the name. I don't know how to pronounce but his last name is Mettinger, T&D Mettinger.
Tryggve Mettinger.
That's it. Thank you. So I don't know how to pronounce it, so I just use the initials, T&D Mettinger. Yeah, senior Swedish scholar, right? So he wrote this book called The Riddle of Resurrection. It's probably the most recent monograph on this. So what he points out in this, first of all, he says the majority of scholars, it's a consensus of scholars today, he says, that, and has been for some time, that the Christians did not borrow from these ancient pagan myths. And he says he thinks that there are 3 and maybe perhaps as many as 5 dying and rising gods of the ancient Eastern Mediterranean world that predated Christianity. He's a very careful scholar, a very good scholar, and he says he might be wrong on these things, but he says in the very end, he has an appendix, and he says, well, how might this apply to Jesus? And he says, well, all these dying and rising gods were tied to the agricultural cycles. So, for example, we've heard of, from the Old Testament, we hear of the god Baal, right? And the story about Baal is he is the god of the weather, of storms and wind, tornadoes, things like that. Well, he's got this brother named Mot, who's god of the dead. So he's down in the underworld with the dead. And Mot and Baal hate each other. And one day they're just kind of talking and arguing, and Mot says, well, why don't you leave your clouds and your storm and come down here and I'll show you who's boss. And so Baal says, no problem. And he leaves the storms and he comes down in the underworld and Mot swallows him. Now, how do we know that? How did people come to know that Mot swallowed him? Well, his parents are up here on earth talking, and his dad says, I think something's going on with Baal. Well, why? Because it hasn't rained for a while. And so his mother says, well, I'll take care of this. His mother goes down to the underworld and says, Mot, what did you do to your brother? And he says, well, I swallowed him. Well, vomit him. No, I'm not going to do it. Vomit him. No, I won't do it, Mom. And so she beats him up, and finally he submits, and he says, okay, Mom, I'll do it. Just go on up back to earth, and I'll do it real soon. And pretty soon after, his dad says, our son Baal lives. How do they know? Because it's raining. And so this story was told year after year to children to explain why there was drought and then why there was rain. So I don't know how they do it over here, but I know in the U.S. when I was a kid, and I've talked to other kids my age, and same thing. Mom, what's thunder? It's the angels bowling in heaven. It's that kind of thing that's going on to try to explain this. That's what dying and rising gods in antiquity were to do. Well, what Medinger points out that when it comes to Jesus rising from the dead, it's not tied to the agricultural cycles. And with these other accounts, it was talking about fictitious figures who had lived in the distant, gray, unknown past. With Jesus, it's people who actually claim to have known him, and they're saying it within their lifetime, and it changed their lives. And so he says the riddle remains, when it comes to how the earliest disciples came to believe Jesus or claim that Jesus was raised. I could give a ton of other examples. Let me just give one more, though. In the U.S., this may not work over here, but I would say, it could work over here. So I'll give a different one. We're aware of a boat, a large ocean liner that was regarded as unsinkable. And about 100 years ago, it was on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic, and it was going a little too fast, and it hit an iceberg, and the unthinkable happened. It sank. And more than half of its passengers were killed due to a lack of lifeboats. Let's see, the name of that boat, it started with a T. The Titan. It's the Titan, the wreck of the Titan, in a book called Futility, written in 1898, 14 years before the Titanic went down. I've got it. I've got that book. I've got a copy of it. And all the details are the same. The book is, the ship's name is even the Titan instead of the Titanic. Now you say, all that coincidence, the Titanic story must be a copy off of this. No, this other one was written in 1898, 14 years before. Well, what does that show? It just shows that there are really a lot of striking coincidences throughout human history. I could give you a lot more. We had a president in the United States back in the 60s named John F. Kennedy. He was assassinated. All right, suppose I say, there's a lot of striking similarities between John F. Kennedy and Jesus. Both of them, their names begin with a J. Even in Greek, it's an iota. All right? Both of them had fathers named Joseph. Both of their families made wine. They did. Joseph Kennedy was he made his own wine. I forgot what they call him, but and Jesus created wine. Both of them were killed in the presence of women who loved them. They both received head wounds. They both had brothers who were anticipated that would follow them in leadership, and both of those brothers were killed. Therefore, John F. Kennedy is a myth that never existed, copied off of the earlier Jesus. We say, that's crazy. So I could give a bunch of things like this. You have to be able to show that there's a causal connection between these. So that's an answer. I could give a whole lot more. I do have a lecture on my website, risenjesus.com, that I get into a lot of these answers. And your second question, really important for this lecture, is what about if it's the Word of God, how can there even be one mistake that might be an error in it? And it's a fair question. So I would say this. Christians do not believe, I see you guys look like you might have a Middle Eastern kind of background. Are you former Muslims or at all? No, you are, okay. Thanks for coming tonight, both of you. So the view of the Quran, the inspiration of the Quran is that it was dictated, right? It was dictated word for word to Muhammad, who wrote down word for word what he had heard. Christians do not believe that the divine inspiration of the Bible took place like that. We believe that the Bible is divinely inspired, but the Bible nowhere tells us the mechanism by which God communicated that. The closest thing that would come to it would be in 2 Peter, the letter of 2 Peter, which says, no prophecy was ever a matter of a person's interpretation, but men moved by the Holy Spirit spoke from God. So it's this being moved by the Holy Spirit. Well, what does that look like? We don't know. So let me present something to you. Two models here. One model is God, it's the Word of God, and God inspired these writers by putting into their minds the exact words that He wanted them to write down, and that's what they wrote down. Of course, there's a problem with that view because we can look at the different writings and we see there are definitely different styles of writing, different educational backgrounds. The Gospel of Luke, you can tell the author is a whole lot more educated than the author of the Gospel of Mark. Paul is more educated than some of the others. The author of the book of Hebrews is a fantastic orator, far more skilled in being able to write and to put together arguments than Paul was. So we do see human elements in there. It could not have been dictation like the Quran, or you'd say God has multiple personalities. So in that case, you'd have to say, well, God still had him put down the exact words he wanted. It's just a mystery how it happened. So that would be one model. The other model, it would be, and I suppose there might be more than two, but the other model would be God inspired the authors to have the ideas. I want you to recall these things and just write down, and he guides them, but he's not guiding them word for word. And he's just making sure that he gets the essence of those things correct. But minor details, he's not micromanaging, he doesn't care about some of the minor details perhaps. Now, is there anything in Scripture about it being the Word of God that would rule out the possibility of the second model? I can't think of any scriptures that would rule out the possibility of that second model. Now, that doesn't mean the second model is true. But it just means until we know the mechanism by which God inspired the writers, it's hard to tell what he would allow and what he would not allow. And so under the second model, you could say 1%. He could allow for 1% to be incorrect. And that could still be called the Word of God. To say that the Bible is the Word of God is equivalent to saying it's God's speech in written form. I don't see a requirement of that. That is putting our idea on what it means to say the Word of God. It's not necessarily what the Bible is teaching. So I hope that helps.
I have a question here. What do you think about the Shroud of Turin?
Yeah. Oh, the Shroud of Turin. So just basically, this is something that's been around a very long time. And for a very long time, it's claimed to be the burial cloth of Jesus. And when you look at it, it's got an image on it of like a crucified figure. And it's actually in a negative. It looks like you young folks would have no idea what I'm talking about here because we have these digital cameras. But back when I was a kid, we had film and cameras. You guys don't even know what film is, but we had film and cameras. And you would take these pictures, and you wouldn't even know what they looked like. And once you got through all 15 or 30 of the shots, you would take it down to a store, and you would have them developed. And it would take days. And then finally, they would have these 24-hour service. It's like, whoa, that's awesome. You had to pay extra for it. And you would take your film in, and they would develop it, and you'd come back 24 hours later, and that was just huge. And you'd see what these pictures look like. So, but when you got your pictures back, you'd get the pictures, but then you'd have these little strips called negatives. And these negatives, it's like if something was black and white, the negatives were the exact opposite. It was white and black. So what the Shroud of Turin is, it's actually a negative. It's in that kind of thing. So the Catholic Church has had this for centuries. So in the 1980s, you had this called a STURP team, a team of scientists who went in to analyze it. It's the first time the Catholic Church allowed them to do this. STURP stood for Shroud of Turin Research Project, STRP, Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP. And they assessed it, and they did some testing on it, and looked at it very closely. And they thought that they were going to come in and examine it for 2 weeks and then say, well, this is obviously a forgery, and here's what it is. After 2 weeks and after a while, even long after that, they said, we have no idea, based on what we have today, on how the image got on the shroud. It looks like a scorch. It's a scorch, not paint. It's a scorch on it. They found actual blood stains. They found actual, from bodily fluids on it. There were some things in the shroud that was really interesting, like they found pollen on it, which is unique to Jerusalem, that blooms only around April. They found what would have been the crown of thorns pollen from that plant on the head. They found dirt on the bottom of the footprints that they could trace back to the tombs in Jerusalem. pretty interesting. They found it was a three-dimensional image. How do you recreate that back in the Middle Ages, you know? Three-dimensional figure. They found that the person that was portrayed in the shroud was experiencing rigor mortis, which is a state in which a body that dies a violent death, it returns to the position it was in when they died because the muscles tense up, but it only remains that way for 36 hours. After that, the rigor mortis, the body relaxes again, goes back. Since then, they have noticed that there's like x-rays of the teeth. A dentist pointed that out several years ago, that they didn't even have the technology to be able to get the kind of dental x-ray that is on the shroud until fairly recently, like within the last 10 years. So all these things on the shroud seems to point to its authenticity. But then in 1988, there was some carbon dating testing, and the Catholic Church allowed some carbon-14 dating on it. But the argument was over, well, whatever we do carbon dating testing on, it's going to be a little portion of the shroud, and it gets destroyed in the process. That's what happens in carbon-14 dating. So they said, well, what part of the shroud should we take? Well, let's take one of the main part of the shroud. No, we don't want to do that because that destroys that part of the shroud. Let's take something that's on the very end. No, we don't want to do that because, you know, that may not be, there was a fire in the Middle Ages and part of it was destroyed, and we even see patchworks in it, and that might have been part of what was going on. Maybe it wasn't part of the original shroud, and it might have been corrupted through the bacteria, the polymers that developed on it over the centuries because it had been handled every year publicly back in the Middle Ages. So finally, after a lot of arguments, they decided they would just do a little strip from the very outside. And they tested it, and that dated to like the 13th or 14th century in 1988. And so they declared it forgery from that period of time. But then in the early 2000s, I think it was like 2003, 4, or 5, there was a biochemist who was able to get a little scrap of the little piece that they pulled off the shroud, something that had remained, and he subjected it to chemical testing, and he showed that it was not part of the same, it did not belong to the same cloth that the original shroud was on. And he issued a peer-reviewed article, which means that even if that little piece that went carbon-14 testing was dated to that period, 13th or 14th century, that wasn't part of the original shroud. So basically, the only thing that has refuted the Shroud of Turin at this point is a testing that has since been discredited. So right now, we are left with the possibility that it's the actual burial shroud of Jesus and that the imprint got on there from the radiation that scorched it. I could give you much more about it, but it's really fascinating. Now, do we need it? No, we don't need it. I think the historical evidence for the resurrection is sufficient. But I think it's kind of curious that if the Shroud of Turin is authentic, we actually have a photograph of the resurrection. Wow. It's pretty cool.
I wonder, how reliable is the verbal traditions?
Is the what?
The verbal traditions. De muntliga traditionerna. Oral traditions.
Oh, verbal oral tradition. Well, that depends, I guess you could say. Certainly, it would be the case that stories of Jesus circulated in an uncontrolled and undisciplined manner from person to person, and after decades, they got corrupted over time. There's no question about that. But it's also the case that traditions of Jesus were also safeguarded by the early church leadership. So you've got, like for example, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received, and then he gives some oral tradition that's in a stylized form that goes long, short, called parallelism. We find that sometimes we find things arranged in what are called chiasms. So it's like an A, B, C, B, A pattern. And they do this in order to assist with memorization. We can see the Sermon on the Mount as presented by Luke put in a chiastic kind of format. So there were ways to memorize these things to assist in this. We see Paul throughout his letters, who knew the Jerusalem apostles. On multiple occasions, he's talking about tradition. Follow the tradition I passed on to you. Okay? And by that time, we know that tradition, the Jewish Christians followed a method that belonged to the Jews before that, as the Old Testament would say, that the law of God, there was to be one law, and that was to come from Jerusalem. And we see that the early Christians followed that. According to Paul's undisputed letters in the book of Acts, we see that the church was headquartered in Jerusalem for the first several decades until Jerusalem was the temple was destroyed in the year 70. So the Christian church was headquartered in Jerusalem. And Paul, according to Acts chapter 15 and Galatians chapter 2, the Jerusalem leadership was the supreme doctrinal authority to which even he submitted, and that whatever the Jerusalem church came up with in terms of ruling for practicing the Christian faith and what they came up with tradition had to be followed and passed along by the churches outside the city of Jerusalem. So when Paul says he's passed on tradition and follow the tradition you received from me, and if anyone doesn't follow this tradition, then excommunicate them. This is serious stuff. So the Jesus tradition he was very, very careful to pass this along in a somewhat controlled manner. And we can see this in the New Testament. So one really good example is you've got the Last Supper story, as we find in all four Gospels, but we also find Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 repeating what the Lord said. Now, Paul's writing 1 Corinthians probably in the year 55 or before. And then you've got Luke having the story, and we don't know exactly when Luke wrote, but he could have been writing 5 to 35 years later. But when you compare Paul's rendition of what Jesus said with Luke's rendition, it's virtually word for word. And here Luke is writing 5 to 35 years later. That's remarkable. And then, as I said in lecture this morning, we can actually test Paul on this. 1 Corinthians 7, he's answering 3 questions. The first question, hey, Paul, is it okay to get married or should we be single? And Paul answers that, and he says, hey, if there's advantages to being single, but if you want to get married, go for it. This is my opinion. And then, all right, Paul, the second question, well, can I get divorced? And Paul says, not I, but the Lord. In other words, this is no longer my opinion. This is what Jesus said. And then he quotes a tradition about divorce that is very similar to what we find Jesus saying in the Gospel of Matthew. And so it's like, no, not unless your spouse cheats on you sexually. If they're sexually unfaithful, well, then you can get divorced. Other than that, stay with them. Third question, Paul, what if I'm married to a non-believer? Can I divorce him? And Paul says, not the Lord, but I. Well, what does that strange thing mean? Does it mean I'm not reading Jesus' words here, that this isn't God's word, that I don't have to listen to it? Is this not the red letter edition of the Bible? What is this? No, what Paul's saying is Jesus didn't teach on this while he was here. If you're married to a non-believer, what do you do? He didn't teach on this, so I don't have any tradition from Jesus on this. So he's saying, not the Lord, but I'm going to rule on this, because Jesus didn't say anything. But then he says, this is my ruling. Follow this and pass it along to the other churches. This would have been very convenient for Paul to make something up about what Jesus said, but he doesn't do that. He's very, very guarded of the Jesus tradition to the point where he's saying, no, what I'm giving you now, this isn't what Jesus said, this is what I'm saying. This is not what I'm saying, this is what Jesus said. Not I, but the Lord. Not the Lord, but I. And it says that this Jesus tradition was very, very guarded very well. So when we're talking about what we find in the Gospels, if Mark is repeating what he heard Peter say, if the Gospel of John is written either by one of Jesus' disciples or one who knew Jesus' disciples, those are pretty good sources. Matthew and Luke and all these, I think they're relying on very, very good sources, and they're writing very close to these events. So I think we have every reason to believe that the oral tradition that we find in the Gospels is an essentially faithful representation of what was said and what was passed along. Now, of course, are we reading the exact words of Jesus? In most cases, probably not, because Jesus spoke in Aramaic most of the time, but the Gospels are written in Greek. So there's translation involved, and there's paraphrasing in some cases. So we're probably not reading the exact words of Jesus, but we're reading something very close to it.
Okay, time is flying away here. Here's the last question.
Okay.
Do you see any...
Sure, I think we had one more after this. No?
Yeah, we have. Maybe you can
Okay. Do you see any single fact in your studies of the historical content to be of greater apologetic importance, or is it rather the sum of the facts? So is it any single fact which established the historical reliability, or is it the sum of?
Oh, I think it's the sum of it. It's a cumulative case, I think is important. I mean, even if Mark was using Peter's words, doesn't mean he didn't corrupt it. So I think it's everything put together. Can we verify certain things, and all this? So you put it all together. They were intending to write accurate history. They used good judgment in their choice of sources. They used good judgment in their use of those sources. We can verify certain things, and only a very, very small percentage of those items have a reasonable chance of being mistakes. Not that they are, but they could be. Other than that, I mean, I think when you put that together, that's a pretty strong case for the reliability of the Gospels.
You had
One question.
Oh, I thought it was.
So this is the last question.
I saw him there. He was like really wanting to.
I'm thinking of the question on authorship and how important is it that we know the identity of the authors? For instance, when you talked about the Gospel of John, you sort of said that, it's probably the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. But then if we take Richard Bauckham, that you also mentioned, who, in my opinion, has a fairly convincing argument for John the Elder, but he's not a skeptic. He still says it's an eyewitness account. So,
Yeah.
like, how important is that question, or is it more like a family squabble between Christians, or should we devote energy as apologists to establish that, or is it how important is that?
Good question. And it's such a good question. I wish we hadn't taken this last one. So now I'm just teasing, but no, it's a very good question. So we believe the Bible is God's word, but when it comes to, let's say, the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, who wrote it? We don't know. The early church didn't even know after a while. In fact, Origen in the 3rd century says, who wrote Hebrews? In truth, only God knows. What about in Exodus? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, they're written by Moses, right? But yet at the end of Exodus, it talks about Moses' death and burial. Who wrote that? It wasn't Moses. We don't know. A bunch of the Psalms, we have no idea who wrote them. We don't seem to have a problem with that. Something can still be divinely inspired, and we not necessarily know who wrote it. Now, when it comes to arguments like for apologetic purposes, and like who wrote the Gospel of John, I think this is something we can discuss, we can look into it, we can develop arguments and look for it. But if we're talking purely apologetic purposes, I don't think that it's necessary to argue for whether John was the author, John the son of Zebedee, or John the Elder, a minor disciple of Jesus. Richard Bauckham might be right. Ben Witherington, who is an evangelical New Testament scholar, thinks it's Lazarus. And he's got some pretty good arguments for it. It's like you don't have any mention of the beloved disciple until you come to, I think it's chapter 11, where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, and he's called the disciple whom Jesus loved. And then after that, you have the beloved disciple. And so he argues from that and says, well, maybe it's Lazarus. And he says, okay, well, then you've got Peter. After all the disciples have abandoned Jesus at his arrest, then Peter comes, and who lets him into the court of the high priest? Another one of Jesus' disciples lets him in because he knew the high priest. And he says, well, John, the son of Zebedee, wouldn't have known the high priest. But Lazarus, who was a wealthy man, he may have known the high priest. And so he argues for Lazarus. Actually, I think those arguments are pretty decent. The problem I have with it is there isn't a single early church father, no one ever says it's Lazarus. So the external evidence would be totally against it. Sometimes we can look at some things as plausible, but then we have to look at, well, what are the arguments against it? And I think the arguments against it are pretty conclusive. One thing we could say about the other disciple who let him in, it doesn't say that that was the beloved disciple. It just says another disciple. So it doesn't mean that it was the author of John's gospel that let him in. That would have nothing to do with John, the son of Zebedee. The testimony of the earliest church, even Balkum will admit that most of them say it was John the son of Zebedee, but he says that's based on a misunderstanding, those who say that later on. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I'm open to it being John the Elder being a minor disciple. In either sense, if it was John the Elder who was the author or John the son of Zebedee, we're still looking at one of Jesus' disciples, an eyewitness. And that kind of has equal value when we're talking on apologetic purposes, right? I would rather keep the main thing the main thing. So like if someone brings up things like Genesis and the creation thing, I don't argue for the age of the earth or the universe. That's irrelevant. I mean, I could say, well, St. Augustine in the 4th century said that even in his day, in his commentary on Genesis, he says that those 6 days of creation, 24-hour day, they could have been the metaphors for geological epochs of time. And this is 1,500 years before Darwin, so it's not like an old earth, old universe. That view of Genesis is a retreat because of modern science. 1,500 years before Darwin, St. Augustine was saying these things. For me, it doesn't matter. Now, look, I don't believe that we're here as a result of evolutionary processes, but I could say, well, if we were, we would just either have to rethink Genesis of what it's actually saying or say Genesis is wrong. But if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true, period. Even if Genesis was wrong. So let's keep the main thing the main thing. The resurrection's the main thing, isn't it? If Jesus rose, Christianity's true, period. Thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you so much, Mike, for being with us this evening and coming to us here in Sweden. You are a real blessing for us. We thank God for your ministry. We thank you for all the hard work of doing the research and all the studies and the reading and coming all the way to Sweden to bless us. We have a small little token.
Thanks. I always wanted a Rolex. I appreciate that so much.
Yeah, we thought that was the right thing.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Mike will be lecturing tomorrow morning from 8:30 to 12 at Johannelund, and it's open for everyone. He will continue with the subject of the Gospels, and we'll go on more specifics on the what looks like contradictions in the Gospels. So everyone is welcome to Johannelund, 8:30 to tomorrow morning. Mike mentioned Mike Licona, Nabil Qureshi's books. I think I take it in Swedish. Nabil Qureshi's böcker finns ute på bokbordet. Det finns ett väldigt fint apologetiskt bokbord här utanför med Nabils böcker om islam och kristen tro. Där hittar ni också den boken som nämndes här som jag har skrivit, Skeptikerns guide till Jesus, om evangeliernas historiska trovärdighet. Så vill du läsa mer på svenska och det perspektiv som Mike har gått igenom här ikväll, så är det den här boken du ska skaffa. Kostar 185 kronor, finns ute på bokbordet. Där ligger också en ganska ny bok som heter Ateisten som visste för mycket av en engelska, ursprungligen kanadensisk apologet, Andy Bannister. En jätteintressant kritik av sekularism och den nya ateismen. Är du intresserad av de frågorna så ska du köpa den här boken. Det är dessutom en väldigt underhållande bok för att vara en apologetisk bok. Han använder väldigt mycket humor. Och det intressanta är att Andy Bannister kommer till Sverige den 23 och 24 november. Då är det en konferens i Stockholm som heter Uppdrag Guds rike. Och där vi Apologia kommer att driva ett apologetikspår. Och det är den första konferensen som sen kommer att vara en årlig konferens varje höst. Och där vår tanke är att det ska bli den självklara mötesplatsen, årliga mötesplatsen i Sverige för alla som är intresserade av apologetik. Så om du tycker sådana här frågor är viktiga så ska du boka in 23-24 november, Korskyrkan i Stockholm, och komma på apologetiknätverket. Då kommer Andy Bannister att ha ett antal föreläsningar och presentationer. Kom ut till bokbordet, du kan handla böcker, swish, kort, kontanter, whatever. Stort tack till er i Pingstkyrkan för att vi får göra det här ihop. Känns jätteroligt. Jag vet att det kommer mer. Jag ser fram emot det själv för att komma tillbaka här.
Yes, bra. Stor applåd. Och då vill jag bara säga tack till er som kom. Tack till Mike Licona och Apologia. Här i Uppsala Pingst så har vi också gudstjänster varje söndag klockan 11. Från och med 18 november så börjar vi dock med 2 gudstjänster klockan 10 och 12. Så då är du jättevälkommen att komma tillbaka om du vill. Men jag vill bara önska er en trevlig kväll och ha det så bra.